Talking about the Pre Socratics after the introduction, and the Pre Socratics. This is understanding the world of the ancient Greeks prior to Socrates. The Pre Socratic era lasted from around the end of the 7th century BCE to the middle of the 4th century BCE, around uh, 450 BCE. This is post Homer and his Iliad and the Odyssey. You need to look at these books. They're very important books to read. It gives you a background on the mythology that is guiding the Greek city-states at this time. It is known as the Pre-Socratics because these thinkers were all born before Socrates died. Socrates was born in 469, and he drank the hemlock in 399. We'll cover that when we get to Socrates. Now, these are some interesting facts about this region. Most of these thinkers were not from Greece proper. They were either colonies or nearby islands or smaller city-states. The areas included Anatolia, Italy, the Ionian coast. It's over here on the right. You can see Samos, Thrace, the Dorian areas, Thessalis, Sycros, Samos. We'll talk about those later. This brings them into direct contact with the Persian Empire. Now, the Persian Empire at this time was a monotheistic empire. They were practicing Zoroastrianism, which is the first of the monotheistic religions that occurs in the Near East. All of these guys used observation and reason to produce their answers, but they were maintaining the belief that these are correct assumptions of the cosmos. Remember what cosmology is, children. Always remember what cosmology is. That is the order of the universe. Because many of these men died before Socrates, their books did not make it to the time of Socrates. The books were written on papyrus, sheepskins, memorized by other members of the court. Uh, but we do have fragments of the work, and there are others who cite these gentlemen. Now, while you're citing them, one of the key issues that we're going to have to concern ourselves with, which one of these stories is true? Thankfully, we have very good older historians who studied the ancient world. I've been a student of a few real dandies who studied these lines and if these are actually accurate, if it's been cited by one person as saying, as like, let's say person A says this of person B, who was a pre-Socratic, and then another person, if it matches up, then you could almost, not assuredly, we cannot do anything assuredly, say that this can be attributed to this individual. First guy we're going to encounter is Thales or Thales of Miletus. He's the first philosopher we know of from the pre-Socratic period. He died around 553 BCE. He is the first of the philosopher scientists. He's the first pre-Socratic philosopher we know of, and he had the knowledge of the four primary elements, that of earth, wind, fire, and air, or earth, water, fire, and air. Like earth, wind, and fire. Yeah, but I'm showing my age there. Uh, but these are important, and what he says, and it's one of the most important fragments that remain from his work, is the most difficult thing in life to know is yourself. You'll hear people, this is a very common statement throughout philosophy, but it is one of the more important things you should know. You should be able to know yourself. And when you can finally be honest with yourself, then you can allow yourself to expand knowledge. But this is one of the most difficult things that anybody can do. But he's pointing this out 2,700 years ago that that's the key. He believed that if there is change, there must be something that changes, yet it does not change. There is a unity behind the apparent plurality of things, a oneness disguised by the superficial plurality of the world. Otherwise, the world would not be a world. It would be a disjointed grouping of unrelated fragments. You can see the ye old periodic table, A lot easier than the one that had 114 or so to memorize when I was in sixth grade. This would have been easy. You have earth on top and then water, air, and fire. He believed that these four things must be reducible to one single element. As you can see, I have the gigantic planet Earth here, and if you notice, 70% of the surface is water. So we're going to see that water will be his choice. He believed that all four of these have to be reducible. And for him, it was water. Water is the most primordial, basic element of all of them. It's the first principle and the basic nature of all things. Well, let's go and think about in the 21st century as we continue to look outward into the stars, to look outward into what would make a perfect planet. The first thing that we look for even signs of life, is water, because we understand that you have to have water for our carbon-based life forms. So in reality, this makes really good sense 2,700 years later. Because of this, Thales can be the fellow we could call the first reductionist. That is, it's a process of taking an object on the surface and then reducing it to its smaller compounds. And he did this now. It's a mind game he's playing. He's doing a little bit of a mind puzzle. He's thinking this through. How can we reduce water to a smaller compound? Well, this is going to lead to a problem for him. Anaximander, who was his student, he died around 546 BCE, and he wasn't impressed by his fellow thinker from Miletus. He confronted the question of all things being water with a very simple question. If all things were composed of water, then everything would have returned to water by now. They don't know how old the earth is. They don't even know how old their own society really is. But he knows that if all things are water, things are going to return to this water. If ultimate reality were something specific, such as water, the other elements would simply have been annihilated by water. So there's a problem with this idea of everything being water. The other elements have a contrariety or an opposition or inconsistency between two or more things with one another. You can't take fire and water and put them together and come up with something. One removes the other. Okay, if one was unlimited, without limit, the others would have ceased to exist. We have now created what would be known as the principle of entropy. All things will tend to seek a state of equilibrium. Again, I find this odd because just earlier, yesterday's lecture, we mentioned that water seeks its own level. It seeks its own equilibrium, whether that be in your basement or in a floodplain. For Anaximander, the ultimate stuff behind the universe was not one of the four elements, but it was something else. He called this the boundless or the unlimited. It's apeiron, without bound, limitless, unspecific because anything specific is opposed to other things. The boundless is opposed to nothing because everything is it. Okay, we're going to slow down here. Imagine a vortex with the elements swirling around the boundless. And then a cataclysm takes place, Big Bang, Word of God, deity, whatever. And then these elements were spun off in the cataclysm. What does this mean in a simple statement? Well, the creation of the universe was an accident because they had all spun out of this boundless energy, this vortex. Because of this, it is known that the universe will also end at some time. And we have to remember that this apeiron is immortal and it is timeless. So it comes with it is an infinite immortal item. It does not have a time of death or a time of existence. It is always there. Anaximenes, who died around 545 BCE, He enters this fray with condensation and rarefication. This is a continuation of the rarefication of Thales. The difference, though, for Anaximenes is that quality is the difference in the quantity. Okay? That is, it's the amount of stuff that is packed into a specific space. If we look first, let's take the idea of water. Water, when you mix it with mud, with dirt, will begin to form mud. First, you get sediment, and then as you add more dirt, you'll get a thicker mud and a thicker mud, and eventually you could end up with a mud brick. It's a mixture of amount of water, amount of dirt or clay, the forming of it, and then the withdrawing of the water from it, and you can create it. Create your building blocks like this. This is the building block of the ancient world. So when you're looking at this, it makes sense because by removing water, you create a solidified brick. Now, they did not know all the wonderful chemical reactions that are going on in there, and they had no idea that in another 400 or 500 years, you're going to have the wonderful invention of Roman concrete, which is another object that just a chemical reaction that creates something. We aren't even able of creating this. All three of these first philosophers were from the Greek colony of Miletus, so we call them the Milesians, and they created two very distinct schools of thought. Their first was a simple explanations with the reliance on observation supporting their theories. This shows a commitment to naturalism. That is, phenomenon needs to be used to study other phenomena. The second is monism. We will always be talking about this, so please etch this into your mind. Monism is the view that the universe is made out of one stuff, one thing, one item. It sounds very simple, and at the same time, this is a very complex concept. We'll get back to this again. It's going to be repeating and repeating. After that, we have the Pythagoreans, and the leader is, of course, Pythagoras. He died around 500 BCE. He was from Samos, which is an island near Miletus. He believed that everything was numbers. Everything can be expressed in mathematics, and it isn't as silly as it sounds, since all of our natural laws, the law of gravity, the three laws of motions, Mendel's laws, among others, are explained by mathematics. This is the fellow we can blame for all those math classes we had to take. Thank him. Just thank him for that. The picture on the right, that is actually something wrapped around his head. That is not a very bad comb over or a long piece of hair. I had a haircut very similar to that back in the mid-90s. It was a very strange time. Not only was he a mathematician, but he was also a numerologist, so he's going to get into the mystic view of numbers. This numerology still continues today. It's more of a mystic field. It's not really the mathematics. This is more of a mystical use of numbers. Certain numbers such as 3, 7, lucky numbers, unlucky numbers, 13, the idea of 1. These We're going to keep this mysticism in mind, but we just don't need it as we are right now. He believed there were also to be 10 astronomical objects. That means 10 planets and the sun. And he's not that far off if you include the sun and the 9 planets. I have to include Pluto in this part because it makes sense of his version of what happens. So you just can't go taking Pluto out. And this makes what is known as the music of the spheres. And you can only hear this if you ignore the music of the world. So I'm getting into a little bit of an odd area here. A guy who's a philosopher creating a new form of music. Instead of a scale of 8, he would use a scale of 10. He was very influential on Plato, and his work as a philosopher is very apparent in Plato's work. His followers existed for close to 400 years, and his work in mathematics to this day is still around. Pythagorean theorem, anyway. A squared plus B squared. He was a cult leader. He was also a vegetarian. However, he would not eat beans since he believed that if you crack open a bean, you see what looks like a small human being inside of that bean. Therefore, he did not eat beans. He felt it was cannibalism. Uh, Little side joke, it was a human being. Heraclitus of Ephesus, this is the same Ephesus of St. Paul from the Bible, from the New Testament. Uh, Ephesus was an area that was a stone's throw from Miletus. He believed that there is an exchange of all things for fire and fire for all things. So we've gone from all is water to all is air to there's numbers everywhere, and now we're down to fire. He thought this symbolically, though, not in a literal sense, okay? Heat is used to temper things just as it is used to destroy things. A flame is stable, yet the flame brings change. How can this be? Well, the flame itself flickers and changes, but it's always consistent. If you melt lead or melt another metal around it, you can see that it alters the chemical makeup of it. It changes it. Certain glues that we use today have to be heated in order for the chemical action to take place. So again, he's not that far off, guys. Uh, Reality is composed not of a number of things, but through a process of creation and destruction. So now we're getting a cyclical view of the universe and of the world, that this reality, it's constantly being brought up and brought down. We have a great number of Heraclitus writings available to us, over 100 or so, that can easily be discerned as his. Some of the things he thought were, you never step in the same river twice. Uh, War is father and king of all. Conflict is justice. Please keep this in mind in the late 19th century, middle and late 19th century, and early 20th century. We'll discuss this idea when we get into Karl Marx and Engels. Um, Everything flows, nothing abides, everything gives way, and nothing stays fixed. Some of the only things you can think of that have stood through time are objects like the pyramid and the Sphinx and Stonehenge. But everything else gives way, it vanishes, and is redone by somebody else. So a lot of what he was saying is very it's a different understanding. He's reaching into what we're thinking of. Everything flows. Nothing stays the same. There's change as the constant order of the universe. Heraclitus' nickname was the Dark One. And as we said, there's quite a bit of his material left. And if you're interested in reading about any of these guys, there's a book called the Pre Socratics. You can find it on Amazon. This is the cover of it, as you can see. It's edited by a professor named Philip Wheelwright, outstanding ancient philosopher, very good philosopher of history. If you're interested in this, go ahead and dig through that. It's a very good book. He's very well written, easy to read, and he gets down to the very nuts and bolts of what these ancient folks were thinking about. He also wrote a lot of aphorisms, which are these little snippets, two line statements. They're kind of pithy, they're a little argumentative, and they're always a little vague. Um, if you've ever had the joy of reading any Nietzsche, think of a guy doing what Nietzsche did in the late 19th century, 2,500 years ago. Same sort of thing. It's a very common thing to do in philosophy, is to have these one sentence statements, which can be very vague or very exact, and then people get to interpret them. This is where we get into a lot of problems in this field, is other people interpreting things, especially when the philosopher himself is not there to tell you. Heraclitus' most important contributions are there is a logos behind the universe. There's an order, a logic. There's a governing change. So there's not this chaotic things just falling down and mountains springing up in the middle of the afternoon and later that afternoon just being crushed down again. No, there has to be this thing that's maintaining the universe. The Logos doctrine impressed Plato, and he developed his notions for the laws of nature out of this. Natural law, these are the laws of science, things that when you look at them, they really cannot be changed. We begin to understand that certain things will always happen. The sun is the center of the universe. They did not know at this time it was the center of our solar system and our universe, not the earth. These laws they're able to be changed, but most of the time, again, like the law of gravity, this cannot be altered. His work also influenced both Christianity, since both God and Christ are equated with logos. Remember, logos is word or arrangement of words in the Gospel of John. The Word was with God, and God was the Word. That's a pretty telling statement right there. So we see the start of someone trying to make some order in the universe. And we need to remember, outside of do we or do we not have free will, which is the question for your paper, order is very important for this course. And that is because what we're doing is we're putting a framework of order on what we're observing in the universe. We're trying to understand what is happening. Parmenides is the next guy in line, and he's a little bit different than Heraclitus. He doesn't have all this Heraclitus movement, action, activity. Uh, he's what would have been called an extremist in the ancient world in his contributions. It may not be as extreme as we think when we think of extremism now, but it was very extreme for the time. Uh, For him, it is the most self-evident of truth to simply state that it is. This is not empirical. As we know, we can't prove that it is, but the reason we cannot prove it is because it cannot be made simply by an observation. That's important, because as of now, we were doing everything as an observation, as what we experience, what we see in the universe. Reason, it cannot be negated or denied, and if you do, you get it is not, and if you do that, then nothing actually exists. And how do we prove it is not when proving it is not just proves that nothing exists? So we have to go with the idea of it is. Nothing cannot be thought without thinking about it as something. You can't think of nothing and not have an idea of what nothing is. This is important here. There's the concept of nothing. From the mere idea of being, it follows that being is uncreated, indestructible, eternal, and indivisible. Remember, being falls under ontology, and so we'll encounter this question again and again, especially when we get to the 20th century. Uh, being is spherical, according to Parmenides, since only a sphere is equally real in all directions. If being is, then being is space. There is no space without being. Space is something, and it must be in order to exist. Space has to be something in order for it to exist. It's a very simple idea. Parmenides has strayed a long way from what we call common sense and facts revealed to us by our senses. These are not phenomenological problems. These are not things like you can feel rain, you can feel hail, you can feel a hot stove. Okay? Being is not, I can feel being, I can see being. No, being is a mental state. It's something we have to do as a mental aspect. He's followed by Zeno of Elea. He would defend Parmenides and his ideas by using thought puzzles to prove one cannot move. Zeno's method is to argue in reductio ad absurdum. It's an absurd argument. You just continue the argument to a point of absurdity. he gives you the idea of motion, but he does not think you will ever reach your goal. His argument is something like this. If you go halfway to the door, you must then recalculate and move halfway to the door yet again. And then you can continue going halfway into infinity, since we do not know how small movement will be of the halving. It doesn't matter. You're still going to continually have to have this down. This doesn't seem silly that if we realize there's an infinite maximum of number, or infinite amount of numbers, you could go either way continually. Infinity means does not end. And you can divide infinitely because we don't know how small really is. Another one of those interesting little concepts. So what did Parmenides and Zeno do? Zeno's method was to argue in reductio ad absurdum. Okay, they just reduce it to an absurd concept. It's the idea of continually dividing and dividing and dividing. It's like folding a paper over and over and over and over. He gives you the idea of motion, but he does not think you'll ever reach your goal. His argument is if you go halfway to the door, you have to continue to recalculate. One can continue to have, and the movement will be the having. It's a ridiculous argument, and it's effective. We've reached the pluralist. We have Empedocles. He was from Acragas, which is a Greek colony on the island of Sicily. So you're all the way on in the central Mediterranean, right on the boot of Italy. He created the idea of the four roots, which is just earth, wind, and fire. Earth, wind, fire, and water. I keep calling it earth, wind, and fire. Again, grew up in the 70s. That objects are made of different parts of each one of the elements. To counter Parmenides, he created two forces to explain change and movement. His two forces were love and strife. Love is a unifying force. It brings together unrelated items to produce new creation. And strife is, of course, the opposing force, which tore things down to create fragments. 2500 BCE, is there or is there not a Silk Road? Well, there's extensive trade going on throughout the Mediterranean. Certainly somebody from perhaps Persia, or maybe in what would become modern-day Afghanistan in the area of war. Northern India bringing in ideas from the Chinese and in the Hindu cultures of the yin and yang, the idea of a good and bad, of there's a dark and a light, these ideas. Well, this is the same, sort of the same as love and strife. Strife tears things down, whereas love is the ordering, formulating ordering thing. The first theory of evolution develops out of Empedocles' system, and that he believed that prior to the organizing of love, parts were just rolling around and just there'd be a leg over here, or an arm over here, or a piece of a table over here, and another piece of a table over here. And they would eventually come together through love. As they were torn apart, I guess aging would be strife in his mind. Now, we could switch off to Anaxagoras, 500 to 428 BCE, and he's from Clazomenea, which again is near Miletus, and he found his fellow pluralist systems too simple. Okay, so he replaces the four roots with these infinite seeds. Each seed was something like a modern-day element, and all objects contain the seeds of all elements. Those elements, which were the most in number, are the predominant element and the primary element of the object. He replaced Empedocles' love and strife with something called nous. Nous creates objects out of elements almost as God would. There's a key difference in organic and inorganic objects as well, though. We need to remember this. Organic objects had nous working from within them. They created from the inside out, and inorganic objects had nous working on them from the outside, arranging them. Nous is qualitatively identical everywhere, but its abilities are determined by the nature of the body that contains it. A human isn't any smarter than a carrot, but it has more parts: thumbs, tongues, limbs, organs, kidneys, a brain. And because of this, it is more drawn to organizing itself. He's the first thinker to distinguish between living and non-living matter. That is important. So we have that distinguished. Now we're going to get organic chemistry and inorganic chemistry out of this concept. We will introduce again when we start discussing Plato and Aristotle in the next lecture. The final two guys we have are Leucippus and Democritus. These are the atomists. They thought the world was composed of material bodies, and these were called atoms, which means indivisible in Greek. Now, Democritus made each little atom a piece of the Parmenidean being. He set them on paths and planned trajectories determined by natural law. And all of this is done in empty space. So he's got this motion going around in space, which completely throws away Parmenides' idea of, and the Eleatics, of being able to get anywhere. We can also see here that Democritus not only believes in space and motion, but he starts moving his own objects. Motion and space are now natural. We have placed them in the natural world. Space is a natural thing. Motion is natural. Motion is a natural act. Motion is not our problem. It's no longer a problem. We've placed it. It's inertia that becomes the new problem. And the explanation is that inertia is an illusion. And that's as simple as he can say it is. This sounds like, and we're going to get a lot of this in philosophy, where a guy gets to a new point and he just stops. We'll get to the same thing when we read Descartes. You'll get to the same thing if you were to ever read The Critique of Pure Reason by Immanuel Kant. Similar thing in the world is Will and Representation by Schopenhauer. These are things that happen a lot in philosophy, so he just left it right there. Somebody will pick up on it. It seems that by 370 BC, the entire Greek world of philosophy had settled into a materialism, and that there was nothing in the world but material items. So there are nothing but objects and things. And all of these things, even things that are not seen, are still objects. And determinism. That is, there is no freedom, only necessity. Please remember this for your paper when we're talking about, do you have free will? Because we'll discuss determinism as to whether you actually have free will. So we can see right now, that very simple question I've given you, do we have free will? This is a 2,700-year-old question. This is better than me handing you a bunch of books and then saying, write to me what you feel. No, this is going to make you try to make a determination of, do you have free will, by what others have stated in the past and how you think. Not what you feel, not what you believe, but what you think, or what you can prove that you know has happened. And if you have free will. Yes, it's going to get down to a question eventually of something we can't prove. But if we can put enough rational answers together for it, you can get a decent paper out of this. Missed the button there, guys. Now, where are we at the end of the Pre Socratics, and what are the ancients leaving us? From now we have free thought. We've escaped the entanglements of religion or myth. These are guys, their ideas, harebrained, way off, very non-common sense. But then again, they don't have what we have. Okay, even I know my parents grew up in the early and mid 20th century, and the things we have now would amaze them. Imagine what our ancestors, the ancients, would think. The foundations are now established for science and philosophy, and as I said earlier, these work together. Okay? You cannot have one without the other, particularly ethics. The problem of the senses and reason, which Kant will encounter, were first laid out by these men. They set these objects out. These are the things we have to. Immanuel Kant will begin to deal with this with the critique of pure reason, and Schopenhauer will do the same thing with the world as will in representation. We're going to find out how sense works, how this experiential, this what we see in the world, and how we experience the world, how that affects how we think about the world. We saw the first work on a theory of evolution approached by Empedocles. We see that mathematics begins to hold sway over our reality. So what we have here is right before we start to talk about Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. We have a foundation here. Some of it right, some of it wrong. At least they're trying. They're thinking. They're putting their brains to the problem. So the times, they're beginning to change. And we'll discuss more of this in the next lecture when we begin to speak about Socrates, Plato, some of the sophists, and Aristotle.